So thank you for joining us again for a Mass Medic member webinar. My name is Rachel Robinson. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Mass Medic, and I'm thrilled to be filling in for Nicole Owens this morning and joining you for what I know is going to be a fantastic webinar. I'd like to, again, start off by welcoming all of you and saying thank you for joining us. This is one of the many terrific programs that we run on a weekly basis, and we're so thrilled to be working with our partners at Galero, who are helping us put together this excellent session on cGMP expectations for U.S. drug-led versus device-led combination products. So before we get started, just a few little housekeeping things. We do encourage Q&A. So there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen or on the side of your screen, depending on how you are looking at it as a viewer. We're all very familiar with Zoom at this point, I'm sure, but we absolutely encourage Q&A. If you pop your questions in throughout the presentation, our wonderful team at Galero is going to take a look at those at the end and do some live Q&A to make sure those get answered and make sure you have the right information. So we strongly encourage you to do that. Otherwise, this is a very interactive session, and I'm excited to kick things off to Hope Tuck. I'm going to turn things over to you, Hope.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Hi, everyone. My name is Hope Tuck. I am the VP of Quality and Compliance with Galero. We are going to be presenting to you today the cGMP expectations for U.S. drug-led and device-led combination products. On our panel, we also have Susan Needle, who is the president of the Combination Products Consulting Service, and Jim Fentress, our Director of Regulatory Affairs here at Galero. So we're going to turn the conversation over to Susan and make sure we have plenty of time at the end for questions. So welcome, and we hope you enjoy our presentation.
Thanks, Hope. All right, so I'm going to dive right into the the United States cGMP expectations for drug-led and device-led combination products. This is really foundational to make sure that everybody's on the same page for the rest of the presentation. Medical devices, drugs, biological products, we're all familiar. There's different types of medical products. The products themselves differ in how they're defined, jurisdiction to jurisdiction. In some jurisdictions like Europe, they refer to drugs and biological products as medicinal products. But regardless of where you're thinking, the definitions are focused on the intended use of those products. For medical devices in general, they are considered instruments, apparatus, implements, machines, contrivances, and go to the last few words of the sentence. They are not dependent on being metabolized to achieve their intended use, and that's key when it comes to medical devices. For drugs, they are articles other than food intended for use in diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease. Typically, they function through chemical or metabolic action, and they're often synthesized, and they're considered as quote unquote small molecules. And finally, we get to biological products. These are the viruses, therapeutic serums, blood-based products. They may include human cells, tissues, or cellular or tissue-based products. And typically, these are things that are considered quote unquote large molecule products. So what is a combination product? Well, I know what all these medical products are. A combination product is one, and it's defined under 21 CFR 3.2e, where each of these medical products is combined with another one. Okay, so I could have a drug with a device, a drug with a biological product with a device, or a drug, biological product, and device all working together to achieve their intended use. So those medical products that are used in those combination products are referred to as constituent parts. So if you hear me use the term constituent parts as we talk, that is what I'm referring to. It's the medical product constituent of the combination product. When the regulations for combination products went into play back in 2013, the notification from the FDA said that these regulations apply not just to new products, but also to legacy products. And more recently, these regulations started to apply to ophthalmological products. And same thing applies. It applies to legacy and to new products. Now, what's the big deal about combination products? Why did we care so much? Well, they bring together the life sciences, the pharmaceutical sciences, engineering, and technology. So when we think about these, many drugs or biological products are now dependent on medical devices for the administration of that drug or biological product. And likewise, increasingly, medical devices are enhancing their performance by adding in drugs or biological substances as constituent parts. And you look at all of that, and it's all about the benefits that combining these different constituent parts together bring. And it's the benefits to patients: vascular, wound care, drug delivery, orthopedic implants, dental, all the way into ophthalmologic applications. Now, the FDA defines combination products in different configurations. So I can have a single entity combination product where the products are physically or chemically combined or mixed. I can have a co-packaged combination product where the different constituent parts are packaged together, but they're not physically or chemically mixed. And then I have cross-label combination products where the different constituent parts are marketed separately or distributed separately. And however, they are required to be used together in order to achieve the intended use. And these are just some examples. On the top, we've got a pre-filled syringe. This one happens to be a drug device biologic. So I've got a drug diluent, I've got a biological product that diluent is intended to solubilize, and then I've got my syringe, which is intended to deliver that drug biologic mix. Co-packaged combination products, here's examples where maybe I have a vial of a drug or a biologic, and then I've got the needle devices that are included with it. And maybe there's a syringe that includes diluent that's going to be used to resolubilize the drug that's inside the vial. And finally, in the cross-label category, one example that's commonly given is one for macular degeneration, where there's a drug that is embedded within in a membrane, and the release of that drug is driven by the specific wavelengths of a light activation system to release the drug. Now, when I have communicated all this, I keep saying, well, there's devices, there's drugs, there's biological products, and they're all different constituent parts. In this first example I gave you with a dual chamber syringe, where I have a diluent that's considered a drug, I have a biological product, which is the active that I'm trying to solubilize in order to deliver it through that syringe system. And then I've got the syringe, which is there to administer that drug. So this is an example of a drug biologic device combination product. The mode of action is the means by which each one of these constituent parts is achieving its mode of action or its intended therapeutic effect. The primary mode of action is amongst all the modes of action of this product, which is the single mode of action of the combination product that is providing the most important therapeutic effect. So in this example, I told you that the whole point of this was to solubilize that biological product active using the diluent and deliver it through the syringe. So in this example, my biological product is actually the primary mode of action for this given drug device biologic combination. The primary mode of action is a very important concept. It's applied across most jurisdictions. Albeit there are different interpretations of what they consider the primary mode of action to be for any given product. But that primary mode of action and the configuration of your combination product are going to influence which regulations you follow, your pre-market pathways, everything from your lead jurisdictions and specification development to post-market surveillance and reporting. So it's very, very important concept. Usually combination products are reviewed aligned with the product primary mode of action. There are some nuances to it though, and specific to the FDA, there may be times when even if the biological product is quote unquote primary, there's been agreements within the FDA that assigns it to CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, for review. So there's nuances to this, there's exceptions, but generally, that primary mode of action will drive your lead center. So the FDA has this algorithm that they apply when they're determining that primary mode of action, or when you're even deciding whether or not your product is a combination product. Is it a pure drug, a biological product, a device, or is it combination product? Applications will go to the Office of Combination Products. They have two different systems. One is a pre-request for designation, or a formal request for designation. The pre-RFD is informal, it's not binding. You have a chance to make updates to potentially influence what the determination of lead center is or primary mode of action. The formal binding one is one that it's formal, it's binding. unless you're going to go through an appeals process, you're probably going to be restricted to whatever primary mode of action they dictate to you. So the product designation and the lead center assignment then translates to how we refer to these combination products. If I have a primary mode of action that is drug, that typically is referred to as a drug-led combination product, and its oversight is provided by CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. If the lead center is devices and the primary mode of action is device, then I'm going to refer to my product as a device-led combination product. The Center for Devices and Radiological Health then will provide oversight. And then finally, if I have a biological product-led product, then the Center for Biologic Evaluation and Research would provide oversight, unless, of course, any of those exceptions apply that I referred to on the previous slide. I've included links here to the different types of request for designation process in case that's something that you need to go through for your products. Now, of critical importance to any product is the controls that you implement to ensure their safety, efficacy, reliability, and usability. That's for any medical product. When it comes to combination products, those controls have very specific goals. First, we want to make sure that the drug or the biological product is working as intended, and it's safe and effective for its intended use. I want to make sure that the medical device constituent part is also working properly. And then I want to make sure that my drug and or biological product is working together well with the device constituent part. And then finally, I need to make sure that my user can actually safely, effectively, and reliably administer their complete dose of the drug. So these are kind of the puzzle pieces that we're putting together as we deal with controls for combination products. And when we talk about cGMPs, or current good manufacturing practices for combination products, we're referring to the entire combination product, each of its constituent parts, the device, the drug, the instructions for use, and the labeling and packaging. Okay, and that's what this is intended to illustrate here in this diagram. So current good manufacturing practices, or cGMPs for short, provide for systems to assure proper design, monitoring, and control of the manufacturing processes and facilities. They are a framework for the minimum requirements to assure product quality. The FDA has communicated cGMP expectations for drugs under 21 CFR 210 and 211, for medical devices under 21 CFR 820, which as of 2026, I won't get into details, will be referred to as the Quality Management System Regulation. And finally, biological products are based on 21 CFR 210, 211, the drug cGMPs, as well as the 21 CFR 600 to 680 or 1271 for human cell tissue therapy products. These are all required if you have a biological product in terms of the controls for good manufacturing practices. Now, another term that's very important in the combination product space is how to interpret who is considered a combination product manufacturer. So this is defined under 21 CFR 4.2. It's an entity or a facility who is engaged in activities for a combination product that are considered within the scope of manufacturing for any of those constituent parts of that combination product. So such manufacturing activities include, but are not limited to, design, fabrication, assembly, filling, processing, sterilizing, all the way to post-processing, holding, storage, including those of a contract manufacturing facility. This last part I have it underlined is because that's a frequent blind spot for people. Many CMOs don't realize that they are actually now considered combination product manufacturers if they are performing any of these activities that support the manufacturer. Look at this long list of definitions for combination products, or bringing together the constituent parts. A combination product manufacturer is expected to satisfy the cGMP requirements for each constituent part and the combined use system as a whole, ensuring that each constituent part and that combination product as a whole is safe, effective, and usable as intended. The constituent parts of a combination product, very importantly, they retain their regulatory status. So if I have a drug device combination product, then the drug retains its regulatory status and the device retains its regulatory status even after they are combined. Okay, so the final rule clarifies that the cGMP requirements that apply to each of the constituent parts still apply to it once the combination product is formed. Okay, and this is referred to as a cGMP operating system, which means what is the cGMP base quality system that your organization is choosing to use that you need to augment to ensure that you've addressed each of the constituent parts of your combination product and the controls that they require. Now, the FDA has recognized something called a streamlined approach. In this streamlined approach, they look at the device quality system regulations and the drug cGMPs, because remember, the drug cGMPs are in common both to drugs and to biological products. And if we compare these to one another, what you start to see is, okay, they're both risk-based, right? One's ISO 14971, the other one is ICHQ9 based. But even beyond that, okay, look at this. Drug cGMPs, they start out with parts talking about quality management system scope and organization and personnel that overlaps with the management controls, doc controls, change control, and corrective and preventive action in the device world. Buildings and facilities and equipment. Oh, look at that. Equipment and facility controls, very similar. Component and containers and closures, very similar to the concept of purchasing controls on the device side. Production and process controls. Oh, look at that. Production and process controls. It matches up. And then finally, we have this thing called design controls on the device side, which in part is covered through packaging and labeling. So the conclusion from looking at this is that there's a lot of common elements between the drug cGMPs and the device cGMPs. The FDA recognizes that and says that you can demonstrate compliance to the expectations for combination product cGMPs by leveraging those common elements between their quality systems for each of the constituent parts and augment your base quality system with the distinctly interpreted, what they call called out provisions of the quality management system for the other constituent part that your base quality management system does not address. Okay, and so just explaining this a little bit further, and I'm going to go through this quickly. But if you have a base cGMP operating system that is based on 21 CFR 210-11 or the drug cGMPs, then for your drug device combination product that includes the device, you're going to have to augment your quality system with management controls, design controls, purchasing controls, and CAPA as interpreted specifically by the device regulations. Okay, so those regulations will overrule where there's a conflict with the drug cGMPs. Installation and servicing are also expectations. Most combination products don't have those to worry about, but those are also considered called out provisions. So very quickly, brief description of each of those. Management controls are those to ensure that the top level corporate commitment has a commitment to quality. Okay, so they're providing adequate resources. They're making sure that the quality system is functioning the way it needs to. Design controls is about controlling your design process, very similar to the concept of quality by design on the pharmaceutical side, but it's to assure that the device and the combination product will meet user needs, intended uses, and specified requirements. Purchasing controls are establishing procedures for supplied products and surfaces. And most companies that are manufacturing combination products are at least purchasing one of the constituent parts for their combination products. So it's got plans for outsourcing, selection of your suppliers, supplier evaluation and acceptance, approving your suppliers, having quality agreements in place. Finally, we get into CAPAs, and these are the actions taken to identify nonconformities, eliminate them, and eliminate the causes of potential nonconformities or other potential undesirable situations, and truly eliminating them at the root cause to prevent problems from happening again. This is based on appropriate statistics and analysis, which is a very important concept in the device side. And then installation and servicing. If you have a product that you're installing, this is not talking about implantation, it's installing. Like I've got a device that's a device with software. That might be something that I'm installing at a facility. Then any kind of support that has to be done for that is included as a call out, as is the servicing and repair of that kind of equipment. If I have a streamlined approach that's based on a device quality management system, then you've got drug called out provisions, and these are very prescriptive requirements. On the device side, when I talked about those called out provisions, they're broad because there's all sorts of types of devices. But on the drug side, the called out provisions are very prescriptive and they're very focused on the drug constituent part. So briefly, the testing and approval and rejection of components is focused on ensuring that your incoming components and containers and closures are appropriate for use prior to being integrated in your product. Calculation of yield is verifying at appropriate points that the manufacturing process is producing the expected yield. Very focused on the drug. Ensuring that your over-the-counter products have adequate protection against tampering, expiration dating, taking into account each of the constituent parts and the combination product as a whole. Testing and release for distribution is confirming that that drug product conforms to its specifications prior to release. Stability testing, again, taking into account each constituent part and their potential interactions in the combination product. Special testing requirements, for example, with ophthalmic ointments, making sure that you don't have particulates. And then reserve samples is another call out, making sure that you've got enough samples that are held back from lots so that if you have to do any investigations post-distribution, you have the samples to be able to do the appropriate work. And finally, if you had a biological product in your combination product, all the biological callouts are considered unique. So it would work the same way as what you just had for the drug-based quality system or the device-based quality system. You'd have to augment it with all the biologic callouts. The FDA, I won't go into it, but they also came out with a document in 2022 on alternative mechanisms to the streamlined approach. And these are mechanisms that will support your showing compliance without necessarily having to do duplication of effort. So I already told you that there's some similarities between quality by design and design controls. The FDA recognizes that and they say, okay, you can leverage some of the work that you may have already put in place, pre-existing information that's going to be accepted, provided that the bases that's covered in this document are applied. So with that, I'd like to thank you, and I am going to turn it now over to Jim Fentress. And I will mention that there is a book that was published last year. The FDA peer reviewed it, called the Combination Products Handbook, that is very valuable resources in this area if you're trying to get more information. And with that, I'll turn it to Jim.
Thank you. I'm Jim Fentress. I'm the Director of Regulatory Affairs here at Galero. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what kind of regulatory assistance you should expect from your CDMO. And before I do, I actually have to share the slide, which I'm doing now. So bridging together some of the things that Susan was talking about, we are a contract design and manufacturing facility that operates a base device quality system with the adopted provisions of 21 CFR Part 210-211. So with that in mind, I wanted to take just a little bit of a step back and talk about some of the routes of approval, either for production or investigative devices, depending upon what type of combination products that we're dealing with. Susan already mentioned combination products typically go to the review center that has the most experience with the product, which mostly aligns with the primary mode of action. And for CDRH would handle device-led products. And the regulatory filings we typically see with that, of course, would be most usually a PMA, occasionally a de novo, rarely a 510K, and then IDE for investigative work. For biological-led products, that's going through CBER. Their application's a BLA, and they do investigative products under IND. And then the last one, which I've bolded, if you can make it out, which is CDER for drug-led combination devices. And I've bolded this because by and large, this is the most common approach that we've seen with the customers that we work with. And NDAs rather than ANDAs, usually 505B1s, or typically 505B2s, and then INDs are the most common approval routes that we assist customers with. So how should a CDMO be able to assist pharmaceutical partners? And there's quite a few. This is clearly not an exhausted list. And in fact, Of the three, number one, two, three, that's listed here, I'm only going to talk to you about subsets of two because of our limited time. But clearly, a CDMO should be able to assist with the design and development of device constituent parts and drug packaging parts, since in many cases, the container closure is made up of the final combination device packaging. And in many cases, combination products, the device constituent elements, are primary packaging and that they're touching the drug itself. Skipping to three, your CDMO should pretty much obviously be able to assist with investigative and production manufacture of combination products. So one and three aren't super interesting, but two is. So from a regulatory perspective, we assist our pharmaceutical partners, and most CDMOs should do the same in a number of different ways, both pre-approval and during the approval process. So I'm going to highlight and talk to only about three of these: risk management, product requirements, and then how those device constituent parts are addressed in subsequent regulatory filings. So looking at this, let's talk about risk management first. And I am doing a violation of presenter rules, which is you shouldn't show people the wrong way to do things. But I am going to show you the wrong way to do things because, one, it actually feels right from an intuitive perspective, and it's very commonly employed, and very occasionally it works out. But typically it's the wrong approach. So that's the approach I've shown on the left here. When doing risk management, the wrong way to do it is to simply do all of your drug risk management under your existing ICH-Q9 risk management process, and do all of your device risk management through a 14971 approach, and bring them together at the end at the time that you're making your regulatory filings. Like I said, that often doesn't work. In fact, it so commonly doesn't work. That's why I put nope there with the explanation point. The proper way to do it. So yes, you do have to take into account from a risk management perspective the drug part and the device part, but you also need to very carefully take into consideration device-drug and drug-device interactions. So for example, a device-drug interaction would be the way that the device could affect the drug product. So there could be extractables, leachables, there could be some sort of device degradation product that then gets put into a fluid pathway for a drug and alters some of your critical to quality attributes. And likewise, there could be a drug device interaction that might not otherwise be seen if everything was looked at independently. Like, for example, DMSO is an excipient, which is fine for storage, but during use, it interacts harshly with the plastic components of the device and cause a device failure. So it's very important to take these drug device and device drug interactions into account when conducting your risk management. And the way to do that is to have a risk management plan that integrates everything. I've highlighted here AAMI TIR 105, which I forget the exact title of it, but it's risk management for combination products. And it's drafted in accord with that streamlined quality system approach and in 4.4, 21 CFR 4 in general from the FDA's perspective. And it provides a way of and guidance on how to bring everything together into a cohesive risk management plan where everything is assessed and then brought into a risk management report. So your CDMO should be able to assist with the risk management process, especially for those components that you're least familiar with. Now, going on to combination product requirements. And when I say requirements, I'm actually using it in a specialized way. I mean product requirements as a design input as seen in the Part 820 quality system regulations. And so when we're formulating the product requirements for the device constituent elements. Now, if we look at the circle on the right, if it's a combination product and it's being reviewed as a drug product, it's still okay to start from the premise of building out some of the requirements from those requirements which would exist if it was simply a device product. So that includes FDA consensus standards, the special controls associated with it as it would have been classified as a device, and any ad hoc considerations, because usually you're launching a new device because it does something new. And so consensus standards don't always include everything that you need to test it. So that's not a surprise. But when it's part of a drug combination product in particular, you also need to take into account the specifications from the drug perspective. Most notably and most importantly for product requirements are the critical quality attributes, the critical material attributes, and the critical process parameters. Now, there's actually a feedback loop here too, because I mentioned in single entity combination products where everything is combined into one, often your device design is at least part of the container closure system for the drug product. And either that could be through being secondary packaging only, or you could actually be part of the primary packaging if your device is contacting the dosage form. Lastly, there's a little orphan at the bottom, which is combination product human factors. So I wanted to highlight this because human factors rules for drugs and devices are somewhat different, and that your CDMO may be able to assist with human factors approaches necessary for both drug clearance and to ensure that they take into account the appropriate critical tasks for combination products. So I'll highlight just one difference between devices and drugs in that respect. A critical task from a human factors perspective for devices only are tasks where the failure of the task could cause serious injury. But from a drug perspective, a critical task requiring validation then would be any task which could cause any injury. And so some of these subtleties need to be taken into account when addressing a human factors approach for combination products. The last thing I wanted to talk to you about is what most commonly us and other CDMOs are called upon to support in customer drug filings, typically NDA, IDE, like I highlighted earlier. And a lot of that comes into the ECTD, the Electronic Common Technical Document for drug filings, and Module 3 in particular for most of it. And I'm going to go through a few of them here. I realize it's a busy slide. That's annoying, but it's actually representative of what we're seeing. 32P3, manufacturer. So as a CDMO, a contract manufacturer for a combination product, they're going to be involved with a manufacturing facility, activities, processes, and controls. And so a lot of that information will go into 32P3. For 32P5, even if what we commonly see is a final drug product comes into a plant like ours and we merge it into a combination product, the final release is often done by us, in which case those final lot release specifications, including things like pyrogenicity, um, controlled release dosage forms, sterility, are part of what needs to go into 32P5. And as I've already talked about, often container closure system needs to be addressed, especially when device constituent elements represent part of that container closure system, which is very, very often. But the bulk of device constituent information tends to go in section 32R in the United States. And so that would basically be all of the device information necessary to review the safety and efficacy of that that's not already covered in some of these other sections up above. So you'll recognize a lot of the terms from 21 CFR 820.30 design control, certainly the first three: inputs like your product requirements, outputs like specifications, and the design verification and validation, with the addition commonly of risk management and an overall traceability matrix for everything. But for the most part, most of this information goes into 32R. And since I mentioned it earlier, Module 5 addresses human factors. That said, 32R and some of the associated sections of the ECT aren't the only ways in which you could provide information about device constituent elements. And I've listed a few of them here, but I want to give a caveat at both the beginning and the end. It's most commonly and most appropriately used, some of these routes, when developing a platform device product that's meant to deliver multiple different drugs, either from the same or different manufacturers, or in the case usually of drug component suppliers that have that aren't commonly going to share all of their requirements, but will do so in, for example, a drug master file. But with device constituent parts, in addition to incorporation into a drug master file, two other things that we can see is you can actually do a 510K on the device itself, and then in your ECTD, reference with a letter of authorization that 510K is part of clearing the overall combination product. Or you can create a device master file that contains much of the same information. For those of you not familiar with a device master file, it's kind of like a drug master file, but through CDRH and with much less rules. It can contain anything, everything, or nothing. And that's a lead into some of the issues with these approaches. In many cases, information can be put into some of these master files in particular because there are trade secrets that the partner company is not willing to share. And because of that, the FDA will get to review that as part of your drug regulatory filing, but usually not until late stage. So if you've not seen the content of it, those problems don't arise until late stage when everything turns into an emergency. Similarly, with a 510K, you could modify devices after the 510K is cleared in a way that doesn't require the FDA to see that again, at least as part of a 510K approach. There's also complexity for some of these things when addressing post-approval design changes. I already told you about 510Ks. You can change a device that's under a 510K, and as long as it doesn't trigger another 510K, the FDA doesn't know about it. Similarly, because you want your updated prior approval supplement or SNDA or whatever that you're doing from a drug perspective to incorporate the correct information, there has to be a synchronizing of information from these other routes with what your actual content is. So as a general rule, these can be used, but only with circumspection. And with that concludes some of the regulatory aspects that I'm talking about with you here today. There's a lot of other things. There's a lot of other ways to assist, but that's all you're going to get from me today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Hope Tuck.
Thank you, Jim. All right, so Susan provided us with an overview of combination products in general and what the related regulations are, talked about drug called out provisions, device called out provisions, and then Jim delved into what you could do from a regulatory perspective. And now I'm going to share what we've learned as a device first manufacturer from a QMS perspective and what it looked like for us as we've implemented the capability to manage and produce finished combination products. So Galero began designing medical devices in 2002 and focused primarily on devices. About 5 years ago, we added manufacturing to our core competencies, and as a part of that process, we have now started to manufacture finished combination devices. So controls that were adequate for devices alone are no longer appropriate, and we have had to change some things to accommodate not only the combination products, but make sure that our standalone devices also follow similar rules so that we're not implicating or compromising the combination products that we're manufacturing as well. We know that having regulations in black and white is excellent, but there's always a gray to interpret based on how your QMS operates. And if the addition of these types of products to your product mix will add things in your systems that you may not expect, but you just have to plan for. So in focusing very heavily on the drug called out provisions that Susan went into detail about, Galero's QMS generally complied with testing approval and rejection of components, expiration dating, testing and release for distribution, and stability testing. And while we had yield and reserve sample requirements in our QMS, they were certainly not as robust and extensive as they are required when managing drug products. Galero does not operate in over-the-counter materials, so we do not comply with the tamper evidence control as of today. But we're going to go through some details about some lessons that we've learned and how our QMS has changed as a result of this new product mix. So drug product handling offered us a lot of complexities and surprises and things that we needed to be super focused on to ensure that we were meeting those drug called out provisions. So one of the things is analytical challenges. Most pharmaceutical companies have very large quality control departments where they're executing their analytical suite to prove safety and efficacy and all of the requirements for their drug products. But most device companies do not have that function within their organization. So we are developing partnerships in cooperation with our partners to execute identification and finished product release testing and some of the other elements that require compliance to the finished product and how that is released to patients. There's a big element of consigned materials, particularly in early development, because those drugs are being provided by our partners, and some of those are also in investigational stages. So between the consigned drug product and the container closure components, there's lots to consider there, especially in handling. In addition, there's management of sample returns, decontamination protocols, and spill protection, because we do have devices that have been exposed to drug products, but some of these have implications for safety, not only for the patient, but also for anyone executing complaint investigations and follow-on reviews. So there's considerations in that space as well. There's a lot of complexities in supply chain and cold chain. So the further you get into really hard storage requirements like -80 and -120 and things like that for biologics, that offers a new challenge for some device companies who would not require those controls historically, or even have controls in their manufacturing process for those products that can't be exposed to an ambient or a less stringent environment. Drug Supply Chain Security Act compliance around serialization, aggregation, and traceability. And this has to be married with UDI requirements, depending on what the mode of action is and what that labeling requirement is based on how it's packaged. Inventory management of drug product. There may be situations where you can't really identify how much you're receiving by weight or visual because of the size or the construct or some of these other factors related to your inventory, and how to distinguish different doses and different strengths in that same process. Risk strategy alignment with the ICHQ-9, which is the risk standard for pharmaceutical products. That marries very nicely into the risk requirements for devices, but adds a lot of nuances in the drug space. State licensure for manufacture, packaging, and distribution of drug product. Pharma companies have this by default, but most device companies would not. So definitely a consideration as you approach commercialization to ensuring you're meeting both state and federal requirements for handling of drugs. And then TSE/BSE requirements. You may recall several years ago, lots of conversations about mad cow disease. So these are animal-borne diseases that evidence themselves in human usages. So there's a lot of requirements on the drug side around TSE/BSE compliance, but it is a new concept for device manufacturers in that you have to keep all of those drug product contact components TSE/BSE free, and most pharma companies will require certification of same. Okay, so from a regulation perspective, again, going back to where these requirements are in black and white, but then figuring out the gray and how to implement them. For reserve samples, who's going to hold the drug product? Who's going to hold the finished device samples? Is there any value in having in-process samples? And how many and by whom? So when you get to the requirement for pharma where it requires 2x retains, that's very costly and very time consuming, especially when you're talking about very complex devices for part of that delivery. So figuring out who's doing which and defining that is very critical. And retest and rework options, pointing back to that decontamination protocol, or how often or how susceptible your materials are to being hygroscopic or temperature dependent, or these various other things, to consider all of those elements as part of that retest or rework. And yield in theory is a very simple concept, but when you're looking at theoretical yield, you have to have a good process to determine what is potentially a device failure mode, a drug failure mode, and what's an interface failure mode between the two. And then alignment of expiration dating and labeling with UDI. Some of that adds a ton of complexity when you introduce the device constituent with the drug constituent, and making sure that you're complying with those labeling regulations overall. A couple more process-related lessons learned around change control. Change control has to consider all your constituent parts. If something changes on the drug side, how well are you evaluating that to make sure that it doesn't implicate your finished device? The drug volume, viscosity, is it sticky? Does it have implications in the way that the device was lubricated or organized so that it would make sure that the device delivers the drug as intended, and that changes on either one of those don't implicate the other? How do you age for shelf life if the drug is temperature sensitive and the device is not? How do you meet those requirements? Do you age the device separately? Are you able to replace the aged drug so that you can test appropriately? All situations to consider. Med-Affairs clinical input on the drug device interface. Most device companies will not necessarily have the right Med-Affairs resource on staff to talk about, especially in the CDMO environment where there's multiple different types of products and different types of medical action, to make sure you have the right resource to do those clinical evaluations. And then quality agreement criticality around consigned materials, who's the spec developer, who is the finished product manufacturer, what the expectations are for post-market surveillance and annual product PQR reporting. So lots of elements there around responsibility and ownership. Then a couple more nuances around process. The supply chain can be very complicated, especially in early development, in situations where you're relying on your partner's analytical suppliers, where they may have sourced some of their analytical testing as well. So you're in bed with their suppliers as well as your own. Cross-contamination strategy expansion. The controls that you had in place for device may not be appropriate or adequate for drug product itself. Expanded handling controls, signage, and PPE. So not only protecting the product from your personnel, but your personnel from the product, especially when you start to get into biologics and things like that, those requirements become much more significant and restrictive. Label reconciliation. We had label reconciliation on the device side, which gets much more important and critical when you add drugs to that process. And you can't have label reconciliation on one group of your products and not the other, because then how do you show that you have that control across your whole product mix? Material personnel ingress and egress separation and one-way flow. This becomes a much bigger issue the more globalized you become. There are specific markets that are very, very focused on this one-way flow and separation of ingress and egress. And then management of doses, whether it's visual management or some other type of control, when your drug product is fully contained within your device and you have differences in different SKUs and controls that are necessary depending on what your dosage looks like. So lots of stuff to consider. So in conclusion, combination products are increasingly an important means to drive enhanced product performance and differentiation in the marketplace. The combination of these constituent parts brings upon complexities in development, regulatory pathways, and compliance requirements. And leveraging core competencies is critical to success and provides opportunities for growth and collaboration. I personally have really enjoyed my entree into the combination space. We hope that you have found this conversation very helpful. And now we'd like to field your questions. Thank you so much, everyone.
So we've had a couple questions come in during your presentation. So the first one we have is, which companies today are focused on drug and device combination products? Are these both established and emerging companies?
Susan, why don't you field that one if you don't mind?
Yeah, I'll give my perspective on it. It's amazing the range of companies that are involved in it. There's startups, there's also people that have been existing device manufacturers who decide, hey, I want to enhance my product. And by adding a drug coating to it, for example, they're now combination product manufacturers. And you also have the whole range of pharmaceutical companies that are in this space. It's global. It really, if you look around the globe, I've got people that I work with, at least from Australia to Europe through, like, they're everywhere. United States, obviously, there's a huge prevalence because the regulations in the US at least are the clearest than they are in some of the other countries.
Great. This is more directed towards you, Hope, but what approach did you take to adjusting the QMS to start doing combination products? And do you have any recommendations for people who are looking to pivot?
Sure. So our journey began a long time ago, especially on the device constituent side, since we had so much experience in that space. And really, it's finding industry experts that can support you in identifying where your gaps are and then filling those. So we were lucky enough to connect with Susan, who is absolutely an industry expert, and we're going to plug her book a little bit. But we had a lot of lessons learned there. We have done a significant number of gap assessments and reviews, and just making sure that we are giving drug product the attention that they need. So there are nuances that have to be evaluated, but your best bet, honestly, is to work with folks that have been in this part of the industry for a while, because those regulations are emerging. And don't make any assumptions about what your QMS is capable of from a compliance perspective without having some deep dive and evaluation in evaluating it from a risk perspective and ensuring that you're checking those boxes, particularly in the call outs, depending on where your core competency was and where you're intending to go, whether it's on the device, drug, or biologic side.
Can I chime in one thing on top of that? Make sure that if you're doing the evaluation of the call out provisions, some of them sound similar, right? Purchasing controls and material controls, CAPA. They sound similar between the drug cGMPs and the device cGMPs, but the reason that they are call outs is because they are distinctly, uniquely interpreted compared to the base system. So don't just interpret it yourself. You want to make sure that you have somebody from whose comfort zone is the other constituent part to review that, to make sure that you're reviewing it through the lens that the FDA would expect you to, and not just by what you're used to.
Great. And then do you have any examples of specific people who are focused on the drug device combination space, or any manufacturers that people can kind of look towards to maybe see like what products they're working on and see what they're doing?
Well, Galero is working on it. There's a number of CMOs and CDMOs, big pharma, just name the company. I don't know if it's appropriate for me naming them, but J&J and AstraZeneca, it's all the big pharma companies, West Pharmaceutical. It's,
And
just go down the list. There's a lot.
And most smaller companies also, whether they're publishing it or not, are looking into combination products. Maybe they're not calling it that, but they are, because the delivery of some of these novel drugs and improving compliance and being able to do some of these things at home. So there's lots of reasons for adding a combination element to your drug product that delineates you and segregates your product from others in the marketplace. So a particular company may be looking at a novel new drug and thinking, well, how am I going to distinguish this and how am I going to encourage compliance? Oh, well, if I have a device that someone can use at home, then that's going to make a big difference here. So many more companies now, when they're in early phase development, are considering this as a differentiation and a way to make a difference for their patients and ensure that people are following their regimens and making them as easy to use as possible.
It's also, I think 2021, there was a court case that the outcome of that was omnibus legislation, which there's a number of companies, especially in the ophthalmic space, that historically were not treated as combination products, but now they are. And so I'd say that that's probably a new space where you're getting a lot of companies that, like, I always filed just as drug, I was fine. And then they get complete response letters from the FDA because the FDA wants them to understand that, no, the game has changed. You are now a combination product manufacturer. So that's probably a new space. If you were to look across the industry, there's a lot of ophthalmic manufacturers that are now contending with these cGMP expectations and whatnot for combination products.
Great. And then could you comment on the impact of FDA QSR to QMSR transition to combination products?
Yeah, so specifically in the combination product space, the cGMPs that are called out, the device called out provisions, really have not changed a lot. What the FDA did with the QSR to the QMSR is they're now working to harmonize with ISO 13485 2016. One of the things that I think stands out as the biggest shift is management controls. So in the world that we live in today, all the way until February of 2026, unless you have a specific finding during an inspection, or there's an inspection for cause, typically the FDA won't be looking at your specific management review minutes, things like that. Under the QMSR, the freedom of the health authorities to evaluate those aspects of your management controls opens up. So that one's the bigger change. The other one that's very important is under the current cGMPs and the QSR in effect until February of 2026, the FDA infers the requirement that you have to use statistical rationale, both for CAPA, for product development, for validations, verification activities. And in the device regs, it calls out 21 CFR 250, explicitly focused on statistical controls. The ISO 13485 doesn't infer it anymore, it states it outright. So when you read through the expectations for clause 7.3, which is for product development, and 7.4 or 8.0, I think for Kappa. It very explicitly now pulls in analytical aspects, which is focused on the statistics and making sure that you have a very well documented statistical rationale to support your sampling plans and things like that.
Great.
And I'll just add, just as an afterthought there, many CDMOs, including ourselves, because we have international clients, already employ a 13485 system. So we meet much, if not, we meet most of our compliance with 21 CFR Part 820 through a 13485 system already. And I think that's fairly common.
Yeah, and I think for CDMOs, that's probably more common. But where you run into a problem is where a CDMO has historically considered themselves as just a component manufacturer, where now in the combination part world, those components are considered to be device constituent parts. And it's a wake-up call. And there's a lot of work that has to be done to be able to achieve notified body approvals or scientific opinions for the drug constituent parts. There's a lot to it, depending on whether you're drug-led or device-led. So the EUMDR is a whole nother webinar.
Well, I think that's all our time for questions. So thank you all so much.
Yes, thank you everyone for coming, and to the folks at Galero, Hope, Susan, Jim, and Cameron. That was an incredible webinar. So much information. We'll be sending out the video recording for all attendees. And if there's anyone else who would like to connect with the folks at Galero, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at MassMedic. We'll be happy to help you connect so that you can have more question and answer time. But what an incredible session. Thank you all so much. And I look forward to seeing everyone again in a future MassMedic webinar. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
everybody.
Have a great day.
Thank you.